Hello and welcome to Social Church. We've received a really interesting question today that I'm sure you're going to find fascinating. The question is, was the biblical flood story plagiarized from the Epic of Gilgamesh? To answer this question, we've phoned up our friend in America, Bruce Gore. Bruce has been teaching for over 30 years and is the author of a brilliant book called Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible, which we really recommend. I'll also leave Bruce's website details in the description below. Bruce has got a fantastic website with hundreds of hours of lectures covering a vast array of topics. So Bruce, help us out on this one.
Okay, very good. Well, the question is, how was the account of the flood that we find set forth in the Gilgamesh epic, how was it to be understood in light of the fact that there's a somewhat similar account of a flood that we find, of course, in the Bible, chapters 6 through 9 of the book of Genesis tell the story of Noah. And that has been one of the most famous stories, of course, in all the Bible, and it is the subject of a great deal of artwork, and of course it makes a great story for kids in Sunday school. And it was quite an astonishing thing when, in the mid-1800s, a fellow by the name of Austin Henry Layard, when he was doing archaeological work in the region that we would now call Iran and Iraq, out there in the that region of the world, looking for the traditional city of Nineveh that had never been found, actually came across a vast library. People had doubted that such a thing ever existed. They actually, in many cases, doubted that there ever was an Assyrian Empire or any such thing. It all was chalked up to biblical legend. But then this particular man, an Englishman, by the way, a nobleman from England who was kind of an adventurer out there, convinced that the biblical account must be more than just a myth, was looking for it and did find a vast library that's come to be called Ashurbanipal's Library. And out of that came a document written in cuneiform text. In fact, many of them actually, but the one that really captured the public imagination was the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is an epic. It's for that day, it's quite lengthy. By modern standards, it'd be quite brief. And one of the things that was the most compelling and stunning about this discovery was that there was, toward the latter part of the Gilgamesh epic, an account of a vast flood. And in that flood account, the character who corresponds to the biblical fellow known as Noah is called Utnapishtim. And as the story goes in the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh has had a run-in with death. His close friend Enkidu has died, and Gilgamesh has a crisis of confidence. He knows that he's mortal, even though he's part deity, as the myth tells the story. He knows that someday he's going to die, and he wants to find the secret of immortality, and he goes on a huge journey. It's really quite a made-for-movies sort of story with lots of interesting adventures, but eventually he comes across this character known as Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim tells him about a flood. And according to the story from Utnapishtim, he was told by the gods that he should build a huge boat, and that he should take animals into the boat, and that they would survive a vast flood by so doing. And in fact, all of that happened. And then, of course, after it was over, Utnapishtim was given the gift of immortality. And so people read that and they thought, wow, here is an astonishing parallel to the biblical account. And all kinds of opinions began to surface as to just how in the world are we to understand the connection between those two stories, because there's certainly some connection. And those who were more skeptical, of course, as would be expected, tended to take the view that, well, obviously the Hebrews borrowed this story from Mesopotamian mythology, and that we should discount the entire thing, that all this represents is just a certain degree of plagiarism on the part of the Jewish people, the Hebrew scripture writers, to incorporate this story. People who tended to take the Bible more seriously were equally fascinated by this, but they, of course, reached a different conclusion. That conclusion being that it does sound like there must have been some great event, some great flood, and that what we're dealing with here must be two rather distinct memories of that event. One of them passed down through sources that would be worshipers of the true God who got a more accurate perception of what was going on, and other sources, those that were influenced more deeply by paganism and polytheism, and interpreted that event in light of their particular philosophical outlook. It's interesting to me that when you compare these two, you do see some similarities that are, of course, striking, but there are remarkable, notable, dramatic differences between the two accounts as well. But the differences lie more at the level of interpretation of the event than the fact of the event. There are certainly some factual differences. There's differences as to what kind of birds Noah released into the air, and how long did the flood last, and what were the dimensions of the boat, and that sort of thing. There's those kinds of differences that one might expect. But the much more dramatic difference between the biblical account of a flood and the Mesopotamian account, the Gilgamesh epic, has more to do with how it's interpreted theologically. In Gilgamesh, you have a variety of gods. The gods don't get along with each other. They're really beset with all of the same foibles that we commonly find in the human race. They tend to be jealous. They tend to be envious. They tend to be immoral. They tend to do things that are bad. They tend to get themselves in trouble. They really just look like projections of the human species, more or less exaggerated to a higher level, and yet really not much of an improvement when it comes to the virtue of these creatures. And so the Gilgamesh epic interprets a great flood in light of this sort of polytheistic, somewhat chaotic cosmology and theology. And when you read the biblical account, of course, you find exactly the opposite. You don't find any conflict at the level of God. There is one God. That's a non-negotiable heart reality of the story. That God is not acting in any kind of competition with other gods who are trying to challenge his authority. No such thing even enters the conversation. In the biblical account, God is holy, and God is responding to evident wickedness on the part of the human race. That's all absent from Gilgamesh. It's more the annoyance that the human race represents in Gilgamesh, whereas in the biblical account, it's outright wickedness, evil, immorality. The thoughts and intents of their heart were only evil continually, is the statement that we find in the biblical account. And God finally, in an act of judgment, says a holy God cannot tolerate this indefinitely, and the judgment comes. At that point, you have to say the account from the biblical perspective and the account from the Gilgamesh perspective are radically different. And so, as you look at it, I think from a taxonomical point of view, just doing comparison and distinction, it seems to me that the most sensible way to view this is not that the Hebrews borrowed from Gilgamesh, because if they borrowed, they did some extraordinary revision of the story in order to present one that looked anything like the biblical account, but rather that they were simply giving a report of an event that happened and giving what, from the biblical point of view, is a far more rational reason that it happened than you find in the somewhat chaotic version of it that's found in the Gilgamesh incident. The only other thing I'd add to that somewhat unnecessarily lengthy response to the question is that in Gilgamesh you have a great deal more going on besides the flood. In fact, the flood is really only one chapter of an epic that is something like 9 or 10 chapters long. I forget off the top of my head, but it's multiple chapters. There are multiple other adventures and things that take place, all of which are fully absent from the biblical account. And so what the Bible treats in multiple chapters, namely the flood, is almost incidental, an appendix, as it were, a concluding story that's given to us in Gilgamesh. So again, if the Hebrews had borrowed from Gilgamesh, you would think that they might have incorporated more of the Gilgamesh account than simply this one narrow piece of the puzzle that comes up in the, I believe, 9th chapter of the Gilgamesh epic. So for my money, I think that a more reasonable way to approach this is that there was truly a flood, Whether it was worldwide or local, I'm not prepared nor expert to address that necessarily, but that there was some great event, that there was a quite universal memory of it that came down through many different people groups. There's flood accounts in multiple sources in the ancient world. The Gilgamesh account is only the most famous of several of them. But that the one that really gives us the most sensible and probably truthful account of what happened and why it happened is the account that we find in the scriptures.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That's brilliant. If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in a later episode, then please do get in touch. You can contact us on any of our social media or via our website, www.wearesocialchurch.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye for now.